I went to visit my husband's grave on Memorial Day, but when I returned home, I found my belongings scattered across the front yard like debris after a storm. You should have died with your rotten husband. My daughter-in-law screamed from the doorway, her voice slicing through the morning air like a blade. You should have died with that corpse you call a husband. The red wine hit my chest before I even reached the porch. Warm, bitter, and deliberate. She threw it with the kind of force meant not just to stain, but to humiliate. The glass shattered against the step behind me, sending shards across the gravel. My coat, the same one I wore to Thomas's funeral, now dripped burgundy down the front like a fresh wound. She stood barefoot and wild-eyed, one hand on her swollen belly, the other still curled from the throw. Her nightgown was wrinkled, her face smug with victory. Behind her, my son said nothing. He just leaned against the doorframe like the scene unfolding before him was a television program he'd seen too many times to care. I did not flinch. I looked down at the soaked lace in my hand. My husband's pressed white flower, now blotched with merlot and shaking slightly as I held it tighter. I had just returned from the cemetery, the wind still clinging to my coat, the scent of cut grass and fresh soil folded into its seams. Every year I went with that same flower, dried by Thomas's own hands in 1963, the year we bought our Chevy, the year we started our life. That flower had survived war, storms, and time. Today, it had survived my daughter-in-law. I looked around at what had become of my home. My sweaters were tangled in the hydrangeas. My undergarments were scattered across the lawn like trash. One of my orthopedic shoes floated in the bird bath. And in the middle of it all, half submerged in a puddle, was our wedding photo, its frame cracked, our young smiles drowned in mud. Then my son finally stepped forward. No apology, no shame. If you do not sign over the deed by Friday, he said, his voice low and practiced, that damn honeymoon car is getting torched. Do you hear me? I will set it on fire myself. That rust bucket means nothing to me. I turned to him fully, holding the crushed flower to my chest, wine soaking through to my skin. I never wanted the end of this family to come in court. I said, quiet but clear. But you are the one who made sure it would. When I first met Thomas, he was in uniform, standing outside the diner where I worked part-time while finishing secretarial school. It was spring of 1962, and he was the kind of man who said "Mom" to every waitress, even the ones who forgot his coffee. He wore his fatigues like armor but smiled like a man who believed in slow Sundays and warm biscuits. We married 6 months later, just before he shipped out. He gave me a single white flower from the field behind his father's barn and told me to press it between the pages of Psalms. So you'll have something that never withers, even when I'm gone, he said. I did as he asked. That flower still sits between Psalm 27 and Psalm 91. Every year on Memorial Day, I take it out for him. After Thomas returned from Vietnam with a limp in his right leg and eyes that had seen too much. A midnight blue 1967 Chevy Impala. To some, it was just a car. To us, it was sanctuary. We called it our first home because we lived in it those first 3 months, driving up the coast of Maine, sleeping in parking lots and camping near lighthouses, eating crackers for dinner and holding hands like teenagers. It was in that car, just outside Camden Harbor, where our son was conceived. The windows fogged, the moon low, and a love so simple it never needed explanation. Thomas loved that car more than anything he hadn't built himself. He kept it waxed, tuned, clean, even after his back started giving out and his hands trembled while holding a wrench. He said he wanted it passed on. Not for value, but for memory. He wanted our son to inherit it one day, but only if he earned it. Before Thomas died, before the coughing fits took his breath and cancer hollowed his chest, he sat me down with a lawyer he trusted. I need to know that you will be taken care of, he told me, that you will never be at anyone's mercy. He left behind a will so clear, so deliberate, it read like a love letter more than a legal document. If my son cared for his mother until the end of her life, it stated, he shall receive full ownership of the property at 27 Granville Lane and the 1967 Chevrolet Impala. If he does not fulfill this duty, whether by abandonment, neglect, or any act of deliberate harm, all assets revert to my wife, who may dispose of them at her discretion or pass them to another who honors her. The lawyer, an old man named Morris with hands like tree bark, looked me straight in the eyes. This is enforceable, he said. If your son fails to act right, you have every right to act without guilt. At the time, I had no reason to believe that day would come. My son, our only child, had cried the loudest at the funeral. He took my hand and told me I would never be alone. I believed him when he moved the guest bed into the room next to the nursery, when he installed grab bars in the shower, when he said, "It's not a burden, Ma. It's family." But slowly, the tone shifted. It began with quiet complaints from my daughter-in-law, who whispered, "It still smells like mothballs in here," after I finished folding laundry. Then came the closed doors, the cancelled dinners, the looks passed between them like silent accusations. They began locking the garage. The Chevy, once covered with a thick wool blanket and visited weekly by my son for upkeep, sat alone under dust. I was no longer allowed to drive, not because I couldn't, but because I might scratch something. The flower beds I tended were ripped up and replaced with gravel. The rocking chair I used on the front porch was taken to the dump because she said it ruined the aesthetic. Still, I held hope because he was my son, because he had once lain on my chest with fever and I had sung him back to sleep, because the man I married had believed he was worth loving. Until one day, while cleaning the bathroom, I overheard their conversation behind a half-shut door. "We can get over 600 Zalzaners for this place," she said. "But only if the deed is clean." "She's old," he answered. "One cold winter and we'll be free of this drama." I stood frozen, sponge still in my hand. That night, I pulled the will from its hiding spot beneath my mattress and read it again by lamplight. I read it like scripture, like prayer, like something holy. I traced Thomas's handwriting. I remembered how he had looked when he signed it, stern, protective, afraid for me in a way he never admitted out loud. I did not confront them. I did not cry. I did not even move the will from the envelope. Instead, I waited. Because sometimes love does not roar. Sometimes it records. Sometimes it remembers. And sometimes it waits quietly for the right moment to speak. It started with whispers. Whispered phone calls late at night. Whispered arguments behind the garage. I pretended not to notice. That was my mistake. They thought I was old enough to stop listening, too tired to pay attention, too worn out to suspect. But age does not dull the ears when the voice speaking is your child's. That night, I called Martha, my oldest friend, widow of Henry, who had served alongside Thomas. "Martha," I said, steadying my breath, "I think it's time I took your advice." She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Good. Do you still have that little recorder I sent in the Christmas box?" I did. It was no larger than a lipstick tube, designed for journalists. "You're going to need it one day," she had written in the card. "The world will pretend not to hear you unless you make them." The next morning, I tucked recorders into strategic locations, the bookshelf across from the kitchen table, where they argued most often, the linen closet near their bedroom, and inside the garage beneath an old bag of potting soil. Within days I began to collect truths. "I told you," she hissed one night. "We cannot list the damn house while her name is still on the deed." "She will not live forever," he answered. "One cold snap and it will all be ours." The sound of them made my stomach turn, but I kept listening. Later that week I overheard her on the phone in the laundry room. "Yes, the address is 27 Granville, 3 beds, 2 baths, but it needs updating. I can get you photos by Friday. Just crop out the old lady." I pressed record. My fingers shook, but my resolve was steel. One afternoon, when they had gone to a prenatal yoga class, I opened a side drawer in the dining hutch. Inside was a folder labeled Exit Plan. It held financial statements, letters from a real estate agent, even mock listings with Move in Ready circled in red. They hadn't even waited for me to die. They had simply decided I no longer belonged. That night, I made a call to Alan, Martha's son, an attorney who handled estate disputes for veterans' families. "Send me everything," he said, "and record everything from now on. If they're trying to defraud the will, we can prove it." By the end of that month, I had over 40 hours of recordings. I cataloged them in a little notebook I kept in my nightstand. Evidence of what they said behind closed doors. Things they never imagined would one day be played back in a courtroom. I recorded the insults first. Walking guilt trip. Wrinkled ghost. Every cruel nickname etched into tape. Then came the threats. "She's going to ruin everything. I'm not waiting for her to croak. I'll take that car out myself and torch it if she doesn't hand over the deed." The most damning tape came one rainy Thursday. "I have the buyer lined up," she said, phone on speaker. "All we have to do is get the paperwork cleared before she realizes what's happening. We'll say she's not mentally sound, push her into signing under stress, and if not, we push her out." "Push her out how?" asked the man on the phone. "Leave that to me," she replied. I played that recording 3 times before saving it to a backup drive. I found paperwork too. Credit card statements with red ink totals. Thousands owed to online betting sites and liquor wholesalers. Copies of bounced checks. A spreadsheet calculating net sale if inherited. I took photos of everything and emailed them to Alan. In a folder tucked beneath their mattress. Unsigned but predated for submission. The house was listed in pre-sale negotiations, with an estimated value of $695,000. Under occupant displacement timeline, someone had scrawled, on to 2 weeks max. I stared at those words for a long time. Occupant. That's what I had become in their eyes. Not mother, not grandmother, not even human. Just a problem to be displaced. 3 days after I mailed the final evidence to Alan, the doorbell rang during dinner. My son answered with his usual grunt, then fell silent. The man in the doorway wore a simple navy blazer and held a plain envelope. "Mr. Harris?" he asked. "Yes. You've been served." My son's face turned pale, then red, then a shade I had only seen once before. On the day we buried his father. But this time there were no tears. "What the hell is this?" he barked. My daughter-in-law snatched the papers from him, skimmed quickly, then froze. "This is a lawsuit. A petition to invalidate inheritance. A restraining order, a motion to remove us from the premises." I calmly placed my fork on my plate. "That's correct. It's also formal notice that you have 30 days to vacate, though I imagine your real estate agent might be disappointed." "You went behind our backs!" she screamed. "No," I said, pushing my chair back. "I walked in front of you. You just never bothered to look." The courtroom was smaller than I expected. No grand chandeliers or polished oak panels, just cream-colored walls, scuffed linoleum floors, and the smell of old coffee. I wore my best coat and brought the Psalms with me, not for legal purposes, but for strength. The judge, a middle-aged woman with lines around her mouth that suggested she had seen much and laughed little, read through the thick stack of files silently. Recordings, bank statements, will certification, sworn affidavits, evidence of neglect, verbal abuse, premeditated displacement. When she finally looked up, her voice was clear and firm. "This court finds that the defendants, Mr. and Mrs. Harris, have violated both the moral obligation and legal conditions of the inheritance set forth in the decedent's will. The stipulations were unambiguous: care for the surviving spouse in good faith or forfeit all rights to property and assets. Given the extensive documentation provided, including audio evidence of harassment, recorded intent to deceive and displace, and testimony from a third-party legal representative, I hereby rule that full ownership of the estate at 27 Granville Lane and the 1967 Chevrolet Impala shall revert to the plaintiff, Mrs. Eleanor Harris. Furthermore, the court finds sufficient grounds for a temporary restraining order. The defendants are to vacate the premises within 7 days of this ruling. Any failure to comply will result in legal enforcement and possible criminal charges for trespassing." I did not breathe until the gavel struck wood. They did not speak as we exited the courtroom, not to the judge, not to me, not even to each other. My daughter-in-law pulled her sunglasses on before we even reached the lobby, as if that would protect her from the stares of other townspeople sitting nearby. I walked out alone into the soft rain, one hand on the railing, the other clutching the will that had brought me full circle, from wife to widow to victor. Back at the house, the silence was louder than the ruling. They avoided me in the days that followed. Boxes appeared, tape stretched across cardboard, the sound of their footsteps heavy with defeat. On their last day, my son stood at the door with a single suitcase, looking smaller than I'd seen him since he was 12. "Ma," he said quietly. "I'm sorry." I looked at him for a long moment, remembering the boy who used to sit in my lap, who cried when his goldfish died, who once brought me dandelions because he thought they were prettier than roses. "I know you are," I said, "but sorry doesn't fix broken trust." He nodded and walked away. That evening I sat on the front porch in Thomas's old chair, the one I'd salvaged from the garage. The Chevy gleamed in the driveway. I'd had it detailed that afternoon. The pressed flower sat open in my palm, fragile but intact after all these years. The house was quiet now. Not empty, but peaceful. The kind of quiet Thomas would have appreciated. I had fought for his legacy, for his love, for the promise he'd made me keep. And I had won. Not with rage or tears, but with patience and proof, and the unshakable belief that some things are worth defending. The flower fluttered slightly in the evening breeze, and for a moment I could almost hear Thomas's voice on the wind. "Well done, my love. Well done."